For many people around the world today, this crucial chapter of history has slowly faded into the background, overshadowed by newer conflicts and modern political crises. Yet the story of the Iran-Iraq War remains one of the most devastating and influential conflicts of the 20th century. It was a brutal struggle fueled by revolution, political ambition, fear, and secret negotiations carried out behind closed doors by powerful leaders and foreign governments. Millions of lives were forever changed as soldiers and civilians alike paid the terrible price in blood, destruction, and suffering. This is the story of the Iran-Iraq War, a conflict that reshaped the Middle East and left scars that still remain today. In today's world, with tensions between the United States and Iran dominating headlines and shaping global politics, it can be difficult to imagine that there was once a time when Iran stood as one of the West's closest and most trusted allies in the Middle East. During the 1960s and throughout much of the 1970s, Iran was viewed by Washington and its European partners as a powerful barrier against Soviet expansion. During the height of the Cold War, the Middle East had become a critical battleground for influence between the United States and the Soviet Union, and Iran occupied one of the most strategically important positions on the map. Since 1941, Iran had been ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a monarch determined to transform his nation into a modern military and economic power. Supported heavily by the United States and Britain, the Shah used Iran's enormous oil wealth to modernize the country at a breathtaking pace. Skyscrapers rose in Tehran, industries expanded rapidly, and the Iranian military became one of the strongest fighting forces in the region. The Shah invested billions of dollars into advanced Western weaponry, turning Iran into a military powerhouse unlike anything the Middle East had seen before. Among the most feared weapons in Iran's arsenal were the British-made Chieftain tanks, heavily armored machines capable of overpowering the Soviet-built T-55 and T-62 tanks used by neighboring Iraq and other Soviet-backed states. But the true symbol of Iran's close alliance with America was the arrival of the legendary American F-14 Tomcat fighter jet. At the time, the F-14 was considered one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Few nations outside the United States were trusted with such technology, yet Iran received dozens of them directly from Washington. Equipped with powerful radar systems and the deadly IM-54 Phoenix missile, the Iranian F-14s could destroy enemy aircraft from distances of nearly 100 miles away. In the skies over the Persian Gulf and the deserts of the Middle East, Iran held unmatched air superiority. Even many Western allies did not possess aircraft as advanced as those flying under the Iranian flag. But while the Shah appeared powerful on the surface, deep inside Iran dangerous tensions were growing. Many ordinary Iranians believe the country's rapid modernization came at the cost of their traditions, culture, and religious identity. The Shah's ambitious reforms, known as the White Revolution, aimed to modernize agriculture, industry, education, and women's rights. While these reforms impressed Western governments, they angered many conservative religious leaders and traditional elites who saw them as an attack on Islamic values and centuries-old customs. The Shah's government also ruled with increasing authoritarianism. Political opposition was crushed, critics were imprisoned, and the feared secret police, known as SAVAK, monitored and silenced dissent across the country. Although Iran appeared stable from the outside, resentment was spreading beneath the surface. Students, intellectuals, workers, nationalists, socialists, and religious conservatives all began to unite against the monarchy. Despite their vastly different political beliefs, one of the most influential voices opposing the Shah was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a powerful religious cleric who fiercely condemned the Shah's relationship with the West and accused him of betraying Islamic values. In 1964, Khomeini was exiled from Iran for criticizing the government, but exile only increased his influence. From abroad, he continued delivering speeches and messages that were secretly distributed throughout Iran on cassette tapes and pamphlets. His words resonated deeply with millions of Iranians frustrated by corruption, inequality, and foreign influence over their country. By the late 1970s, Iran had become a nation on the edge. Economic problems, political unrest, and growing anger toward the monarchy erupted into massive demonstrations across the country. In January 1978, thousands of religious students marched in protest against the Shah's regime. Government security forces responded violently, killing and injuring protesters, But instead of ending the unrest, the bloodshed fueled even larger demonstrations. Millions of Iranians soon flooded the streets demanding the end of the monarchy. At the same time, the Shah himself was growing physically weaker, and known to most of the public, he was suffering from cancer. As protests intensified and strikes paralyzed the economy, the Shah's authority began collapsing. His once powerful military struggled to restore order, and even some of his allies started losing faith in his ability to control the country. Finally, on January 16, 1979, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran with his family, officially claiming they were departing for a vacation. In reality, he would never return. For many Iranians, his departure marked the end of an era. Only weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran in triumph after years in exile. Millions gathered in the streets to welcome him home as the revolution reached its climax. On April 1, 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran was officially established, transforming the nation forever. For the United States and the West, the revolution was both a devastating strategic loss and a humiliating political disaster. One of America's strongest allies in the region had suddenly become one of its fiercest enemies. The crisis deepened dramatically later that year when Iranian revolutionaries stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and took dozens of American diplomats hostage. Images of blindfolded hostages broadcast across television screens shocked the world and humiliated the United States government. In response, America launched a daring rescue mission known as Operation Eagle Claw, but the operation ended in catastrophe when mechanical failures and a deadly collision between a rescue helicopter and a C-130 transport aircraft killed 8 American servicemen and 1 Iranian civilian in the Iranian desert. The failure of the mission demonstrated just how dramatically the balance of power in the Middle East had changed. The West now faced a revolutionary Islamic government deeply hostile toward American influence, yet armed with some of the most advanced military equipment the United States had ever exported. The consequences of the Iranian Revolution would reshape the Middle East for decades to come, setting the stage for regional instability, international crises, and eventually one of the bloodiest conflicts in modern history, the Iran-Iraq War. At the very same moment that the Iranian Revolution was overthrowing the Shah and transforming Iran into an Islamic republic, another dramatic struggle for power was unfolding across the border in Iraq. In July of 1979, the political landscape of the Middle East shifted once again when Iraqi President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr was forced to resign under mounting pressure from his ambitious deputy, Saddam Hussein. Though both men belonged to Iraq's ruling Ba'ath Party, Saddam had grown determined to remove anyone who stood in the way of his personal control over the country. The Ba'ath Party promoted a powerful ideology built around Arab nationalism, military strength, and an Arab interpretation of socialism. Iraq's neighboring rival, Syria, was also ruled by a branch of the same party. President al-Bakr had even begun discussions aimed at uniting Iraq and Syria into one enormous Arab state, a move that could have dramatically changed the balance of power in the Middle East, but such a union threatened Saddam Hussein's growing influence. If Iraq and Syria merged, Saddam's own ambitions for absolute power could be limited by competing political leaders and shared authority. So, Saddam moved quickly and ruthlessly. On July 16, 1979, al-Bakr officially stepped down, and Saddam Hussein assumed control of Iraq from the capital city of Baghdad. Almost immediately, he began consolidating power in the brutal fashion that would later define his rule. Within days, Saddam launched a sweeping purge against suspected rivals inside the government, military, and Ba'ath Party itself. In one of the most chilling moments in Iraqi political history, Saddam gathered senior party officials into a televised meeting and accused several members of treason. Names were read aloud one by one as terrified officials were dragged from the room by armed guards. Many were later executed. Between July and August of 1979, hundreds of political opponents, military officers, and suspected conspirators were imprisoned or killed as Saddam cemented his authority through fear and violence. But despite his growing control, Iraq remained a deeply unstable country filled with ethnic and religious divisions. In the mountainous north, along the borders with Turkey, Syria, and Iran, lived the Kurdish people, an ethnic group with their own language, culture, and national identity. For decades, the Kurds had fought for the creation of an independent homeland known as Kurdistan, Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Kurdish fighters waged a brutal insurgency against the Iraqi government. Entire villages were destroyed, thousands were killed, and both sides committed acts of extreme violence. During much of this conflict, the Kurds received support from Iran, which used the rebellion as a way to weaken Iraq and pressure Baghdad politically. However, everything changed in 1975 with the signing of the Algiers Agreement between Iraq and Iran. The agreement was designed to settle long-standing border disputes between the two countries, particularly over the strategically important Shed al-Arab waterway, a narrow but critical river passage connecting Iraq to the Persian Gulf. In exchange for territorial concessions from Iraq, Iran agreed to stop supporting the Kurdish rebellion. Without Iranian assistance, the Kurdish uprising rapidly collapsed. Iraqi forces regained control over much of the north, but resentment among the Kurdish population never disappeared. Saddam's government soon began implementing harsh policies aimed at suppressing Kurdish identity and strengthening Arab control in disputed regions. Entire Kurdish communities were relocated, and policies of forced Arabization intensified tensions even further, laying the groundwork for future conflict that would continue for decades. Yet Saddam's greatest fear did not come from the Kurds alone. It came from within Iraq's own religious divisions. Saddam Hussein and much of Iraq's ruling elite belonged to the Sunni Muslim minority, while the majority of Iraq's population was Shiite Muslim. The success of Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic revolution in neighboring Iran deeply alarmed Saddam and his government. The rise of a powerful Shiite religious government in Iran threatened to inspire Iraq's own Shiite population to rise against Saddam's Sunni-led regime. For centuries, Iraq and Iran had also been divided by ethnic, cultural, and historical rivalries. Iraq was largely Arab, while Iran was predominantly Persian. These differences added another dangerous layer to the growing hostility between the two nations. To Saddam Hussein, the chaos inside revolutionary Iran appeared to present a rare opportunity. Iran's military had been weakened by political purges following the revolution. Many experienced officers loyal to the Shah had been arrested, executed, or removed from command. Internationally, Iran had become isolated after the hostage crisis with the United States. Saddam believed Iran was vulnerable, disorganized, and unable to defend itself effectively. At the same time, Saddam had ambitions of expanding Iraq's regional influence. He wanted Iraq to dominate the Persian Gulf and establish itself as the leading Arab power in the Middle East. Central to these ambitions was control over the Shed al-Arab waterway and the oil-rich Iranian province of Khuzestan, which Iraq claimed historically belonged to the Arab world. Saddam believed that a quick military victory could secure these territories while simultaneously weakening Iran before it could recover from revolution. Confident in the strength of Iraq's Soviet-equipped military, Saddam began personally overseeing preparations for war. Despite having never served as a professional military commander himself, he studied previous conflicts carefully, particularly Israel's devastating preemptive airstrikes during the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Saddam concluded that the key to victory would be speed and surprise. The Iraqi plan called for a sudden air assault, designed to destroy the Iranian Air Force while its aircraft were still on the ground. At the same time, Iraqi armored divisions would invade across the border in multiple directions, overwhelming Iranian defenses before Tehran could organize a coordinated response. Saddam believed the war would be short, decisive, and glorious. He expected Iran to collapse under pressure within weeks. On September 17, 1980, Saddam Hussein publicly announced that Iraq was withdrawing from the Algiers Agreement, accusing Iran's revolutionary government of violating its terms. It was a clear signal that war was imminent. Only days later, on September 22, 1980, Iraqi forces launched their massive invasion of Iran. Fighter jets roared across the skies, artillery thundered along the border, and thousands of Iraqi troops surged into Iranian territory. The Iran-Iraq War had begun, a conflict that neither side realized would soon become one of the longest, bloodiest, and most devastating wars of the modern era. As Saddam Hussein had ordered, the opening blows of the war were aimed directly at the Iranian Air Force. In the early hours of September 22, 1980, Iraqi fighter bombers roared across the border and launched coordinated strikes against 10 Iranian air bases. Saddam hoped to repeat the kind of devastating surprise attack Israel had carried out during the Six-Day War in 1967. destroying enemy aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. If successful, Iraq would dominate the skies, allowing its armored divisions to sweep deep into Iranian territory with little resistance. But from the very first hours of the invasion, cracks in Saddam Hussein's grand strategy were already beginning to appear. Although Iraqi aircraft inflicted heavy damage on Iranian runways, fuel depots, and infrastructure, the attacks failed to destroy the bulk of Iran's combat aircraft. Many Iranian jets had been dispersed or protected within hardened shelters. Mechanics and engineers worked around the clock to repair damaged runways, and within hours, Iranian pilots were back in the air. The Iraqi leadership had expected confusion, paralysis, and collapse. Instead, they were met with resistance. Within just 24 hours, the Iranian Air Force launched a massive retaliatory operation, known simply as Operation Revenge. Waves of American-made F-4 Phantom and F-5 Tiger fighter jets thundered across Iraqi airspace, targeting Iraqi airfields, radar stations, and military infrastructure. Iraqi commanders who had expected total air superiority suddenly found their own bases under attack. The war Saddam believed would be quick and decisive was already becoming dangerously unpredictable on the ground. Iraqi forces crossed into Iran on 3 major fronts using 6 army divisions supported by tanks, artillery, and mechanized infantry. The main objective was the oil-rich province of Khuzestan in southwestern Iran. Saddam believed many of the Arabs living in the region would welcome Iraqi forces as liberators, but this assumption proved disastrously wrong. Instead of collapsing, local resistance hardened. The fighting around the city of Khorramshahr quickly became some of the bloodiest of the entire war. Iranian soldiers, Revolutionary Guards, local volunteers, and civilians fought street by street against advancing Iraqi troops. Iranian anti-tank teams armed with rockets and portable weapons ambushed Iraqi armor in narrow streets and alleyways, destroying tanks at close range. Buildings became fortresses, and every intersection turned into a battlefield. The struggle for the city lasted for weeks. By the time Iraqi forces finally captured Khorramshahr, thousands were dead. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. So terrible was the destruction that many Iranians would forever refer to the city not as Khorramshahr, but as Kunanshar, the city of blood. Yet despite eventually capturing the city, Iraq had lost something far more valuable: time. The fierce Iranian resistance slowed the Iraqi advance long enough for Iran to begin mobilizing its population and reorganizing its military. Saddam Hussein had planned for a lightning war lasting weeks. Instead, by the end of 1980, Iraqi troops were increasingly being forced onto the defensive. Supplies were running low, reserves were being depleted, and the rapid victory Saddam had promised was nowhere in sight. Both nations were now settling into what would become a brutal war of attrition. On paper, Iran appeared to face overwhelming challenges. The Islamic Revolution had left the country isolated internationally. Western sanctions made it difficult to obtain spare parts for its American-made tanks, aircraft, and missiles. Relations with the Soviet Union were also deeply strained following the revolution, meaning Iran found itself cut off from both East and West. The once mighty military built under the Shah was beginning to deteriorate. To keep some aircraft operational, Iranian crews were forced to cannibalize others for spare parts. Iran's fleet of advanced F-14 Tomcats gradually shrank as engineers struggled to maintain them without access to American support. In some cases, pilots flew combat missions with radar systems partially disabled or entirely non-functional. The revolution had also devastated Iran's military leadership. Many senior officers suspected of loyalty to the Shah had been imprisoned, purged, or executed. Entire chains of command were disrupted. Saddam Hussein believed these weaknesses guaranteed Iraq's victory. But once again, Iran adapted. Iranian engineers and technicians began developing domestic production systems for ammunition, spare parts, and repairs. Improvisation became a key weapon in Iran's survival. Factories were repurposed, workshops were expanded, and damaged equipment once thought useless was restored to service. Slowly but steadily, Iran regenerated much of its military strength. Meanwhile, Iraq enjoyed strong international backing. The Soviet Union supplied tanks, aircraft, artillery, and military advisors. France delivered advanced weapons including Mirage fighter jets and missiles. Many Arab Gulf states quietly supported Iraq financially, fearing the spread of Iran's revolutionary ideology throughout the region. At first glance, Iraq seemed to possess every advantage. Its military was modern, experienced, and heavily armed. Iraqi troops had already gained years of combat experience fighting Kurdish insurgents in the north. Saddam Hussein had also built an enormous cult of personality around himself, portraying his leadership as heroic and unstoppable. Yet Saddam's greatest weakness was increasingly becoming clear: his own leadership. Obsessed with personal control, Saddam frequently interfered directly in military planning despite lacking real battlefield experience. Iraqi commanders were often ordered to pursue too many objectives at once, stretching forces dangerously thin across a massive front line. Instead of concentrating overwhelming force on key targets, Iraqi units found themselves isolated, unsupported, and vulnerable to Iranian counterattacks. Some Iraqi generals recognized the growing danger and attempted tactical withdrawals to reorganize their exhausted troops. But to Saddam Hussein, retreat was unforgivable. Officers accused of cowardice or incompetence were publicly executed as warnings to others. Fear spread throughout the Iraqi command structure. Many officers became terrified to question Saddam's decisions, even when they knew those decisions were disastrous. This atmosphere of fear would haunt Iraq throughout the war. Defensive preparations were often neglected because commanders feared reporting weaknesses. Strategic flexibility vanished. Initiative disappeared. Many officers simply obeyed orders, regardless of the consequences. One major example of this failure emerged when Iran began launching air raids against Iraqi oil facilities and economic infrastructure. Saddam had focused so heavily on destroying the Iranian Air Force that he failed to prepare adequate air defenses for Iraq's own critical industries. Iranian aircraft frequently encountered surprisingly little resistance while attacking oil refineries, export terminals, and fuel storage sites. The economic consequences were severe. Oil was Iraq's lifeline, funding both its military operations and national economy. Every successful Iranian strike placed additional pressure on Baghdad's finances and weakened Saddam's long-term position. But perhaps Saddam Hussein's single greatest miscalculation was political rather than military. He had expected Iran's revolutionary government to collapse under the pressure of invasion. Instead, the war unified the Iranian people behind Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Republic. Nationalism, religion, and the desire to resist foreign invasion combined into a powerful force. In many ways, Saddam Hussein had unintentionally given the revolution exactly what it needed: an external enemy. Across Iran, young men rushed to volunteer for military service. Train stations and bus terminals filled with emotional scenes as families said goodbye to sons heading for the front. Entire communities organized together, forming regional volunteer units made up of friends, classmates, and neighbors. The atmosphere resembled Europe during the First World War. Patriotic songs echoed through the streets. Religious slogans inspired recruits. Many believed they were fighting not only for their homeland, but for Islam itself. And just like the First World War, the Iran-Iraq conflict soon descended into trench warfare. Iranian forces, lacking sufficient tanks and armored vehicles, relied heavily on infantry and defensive trench networks. Vast systems of trenches, bunkers, and fortified positions stretched across the desert front lines. Iraqi artillery pounded these positions relentlessly while machine guns swept across open ground. Still, Iranian commanders repeatedly launched massive human wave assaults against Iraqi defenses. Thousands of volunteers, including very young fighters from the Basij militia, charged across exposed terrain under devastating enemy fire. Some carried little more than rifles and religious devotion. Iraqi artillery tore through these advancing formations with horrifying efficiency. The deserts became landscapes of smoke, fire, and death. Burned-out tanks littered the battlefield. Trenches filled with mud, blood, and shattered equipment. Entire offensives achieved minimal territorial gains at catastrophic human cost. As the war dragged on through 1981 and beyond, frustration and desperation escalated on both sides. Saddam Hussein increasingly turned his anger toward Iranian cities and civilian populations. Soviet-made Scud missiles and Tupolev bombers struck urban centers, including Tehran, targeting residential neighborhoods and industrial areas. At night, air raid sirens echoed through Iranian cities as families fled into hillsides and shelters seeking safety from the bombardment. The strategy resembled the terror bombing campaigns of World War II, an attempt to break civilian morale through fear and destruction. But instead of surrendering, Iranian anger only intensified. Iran retaliated with its own strikes against Baghdad and other Iraqi cities. Soon both nations were engaged in what became known as the War of the Cities, a cycle of missile attacks and aerial bombardments targeting civilians far from the front lines. Meanwhile, the Kurds in northern Iraq saw the conflict as another opportunity to continue their long struggle for independence. Supported by Iran, Syria, and Libya, Kurdish fighters attacked Iraqi supply lines and disrupted oil exports moving toward Turkey. Their actions placed even greater pressure on Iraq's weakening economy and stretched Iraqi military resources further. By May of 1982, Iraq had lost much of the territory it captured during the early stages of the invasion. Facing mounting casualties and worsening conditions, Saddam Hussein ordered a withdrawal back to Iraqi borders. Ironically, the same Saddam who had executed generals for retreating was now forced to abandon many of his own objectives. On June 10, 1982, Saddam declared a unilateral ceasefire and called for peace negotiations, believing Iran would accept victory after reclaiming its territory. But Ayatollah Khomeini rejected the offer completely. Iran now demanded the removal of Saddam Hussein from power and massive war reparations from Iraq for the destruction caused by the invasion. For Saddam, such terms were impossible to accept. Agreeing to them would mean humiliation, weakness, and potentially the collapse of his regime. Reluctantly, both nations continued the war, and what followed would become even more catastrophic. The conflict expanded beyond a border dispute and evolved into a struggle involving global superpowers, oil politics, international arms deals, and Cold War rivalries. The world's attention increasingly focused on the burning front lines between Iran and Iraq as the war threatened the stability of the entire Middle East. Given the enormous strategic importance of the Middle East and its vast oil reserves, it was inevitable that outside powers would become deeply involved in the Iran-Iraq War. What had begun as a regional conflict between two neighboring states quickly evolved into an international struggle shaped by Cold War politics, economic interests, ideological rivalries, and the global competition for influence. While revolutionary Iran found itself increasingly isolated from much of the world, Iraq emerged as a valuable partner for nations eager to gain influence in the region or prevent the spread of Iran's Islamic Revolution. As the war intensified, Baghdad became one of the largest importers of foreign weapons on earth. Countries from both East and West poured billions of dollars worth of military hardware, intelligence, and financial aid into Saddam Hussein's war machine. Among Iraq's most important supporters were the Soviet Union and France. The Soviets supplied Iraq with enormous quantities of tanks, artillery, missiles, helicopters, and combat aircraft. French assistance, meanwhile, extended beyond conventional weapons. Paris was helping Saddam Hussein pursue something far more ambitious: nuclear technology. In 1976, France agreed to assist Iraq in constructing a nuclear research reactor near Baghdad. Officially, the project was intended for peaceful scientific purposes, but many nations feared the reactor could eventually allow Iraq to produce weapons-grade nuclear material. Construction began in 1979 at a nuclear facility known as Asirik, named by the French engineers working on the site. The possibility of a nuclear-armed Iraq alarmed many governments across the Middle East. For Iran, already locked in a deadly war with Saddam Hussein, the idea of Iraq obtaining atomic weapons represented a nightmare scenario. On September 30, 1980, only days after the Iran-Iraq War began, Iran launched one of the most daring air raids in modern military history. In an operation known as Operation Scorched Sword, Iranian fighter aircraft struck the Asirik nuclear reactor near Baghdad. The attack caused significant damage and delayed the project for months, becoming the first known airstrike in history specifically targeting a nuclear facility. But Iran was not the only nation deeply concerned about Iraq's nuclear ambitions. Israel also viewed Saddam Hussein as a major future threat. Israeli leaders feared that if Iraq successfully developed nuclear weapons, the balance of power in the Middle East could shift dramatically against them. So, on June 7, 1981, the reactor came under attack once again, this time by the Israeli Air Force, in what would later become one of the most famous preemptive airstrikes ever carried out. Israeli F-16 Fighting Falcons flew hundreds of miles at extremely low altitude across Saudi and Iraqi airspace to avoid radar detection, reaching the target at the very limits of their operational range. The Israeli pilots delivered their bombs with extraordinary precision, heavily damaging the Asyric reactor before returning safely home. The strike shocked the world. Some governments condemned Israel for violating Iraqi sovereignty, while others quietly viewed the operation as a necessary action to prevent Saddam Hussein from acquiring nuclear weapons. Although Iraq vowed to rebuild the reactor, the financial pressures of the war and growing international complications eventually forced France to withdraw from the nuclear project in 1984. Saddam Hussein's dream of rapidly developing nuclear capabilities was postponed, though not entirely abandoned. Even without nuclear weapons, Iraq continued receiving enormous foreign support throughout the war. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, both deeply fearful of Iran's revolutionary ideology spreading into their own Shiite populations, provided Iraq with massive financial assistance. Billions of dollars in loans flowed into Baghdad, helping Saddam purchase more weapons and sustain his military campaigns. European nations also became heavily involved. Spain and Italy supplied Iraq with helicopters and anti-tank missile systems. France continued delivering advanced conventional weapons, including Mirage fighter jets and missiles. The Soviet Union expanded its military support even further, providing Iraq with export versions of the feared T-70 tank, a weapon that became highly respected and feared by Iranian armored crews. Iraq also sought support from China, which sold Baghdad large quantities of military equipment, including Chinese-made versions of Soviet tanks and artillery. These weapons helped replace the enormous losses Iraq suffered on the battlefield. As the war dragged on year after year, the Soviets additionally supplied Iraq with advanced fighter aircraft in an effort to challenge Iran's powerful American-made F-14 Tomcats, which still remained among the most capable fighters in the region despite Iran's sanctions and maintenance difficulties. Yet despite its international isolation, Iran was not completely alone. North Korea became one of Tehran's important suppliers, sending hundreds of Chinese-manufactured Type 59 tanks and other weapons. China itself quietly expanded arms sales to Iran as well, even while publicly denying direct involvement. The war had become so profitable for international arms dealers that many countries were willing to sell weapons to both sides simultaneously. Perhaps the most surprising supporters of Iran, however, were Israel and elements within the United States government itself. Israel's strategy was driven by cold geopolitical calculation. Israeli leaders viewed both Iraq and Iran as potential long-term threats. From their perspective, it was preferable for the two powers to exhaust one another in a prolonged conflict rather than allow either side to emerge dominant. As a result, Israel secretly supplied Iran with weapons, spare parts, training, and military equipment throughout portions of the war. These deals also benefited Israel economically, helping support its growing defense industry while opening channels for negotiations regarding the safe migration of Persian Jews from Iran to Israel. At the same time, secret factions within the American intelligence community became involved in one of the most controversial political scandals of the Cold War. Elements of the CIA saw Iran as a potential source of funding for anti-communist rebel groups in Nicaragua known as the Contras, who were fighting the socialist Sandinista government. Since direct American funding for the Contras had been restricted by Congress, a covert operation emerged. Weapons and spare parts for Iran's American-made military equipment were secretly transferred to Tehran, often through Israeli intermediaries. In return, Iran used its influence with Hezbollah-linked groups in Lebanon to help negotiate the release of American hostages being held there. Profits from the arms sales were then secretly redirected to support the Contras in Nicaragua. When the operation was eventually exposed, it exploded into what became known as the Iran-Contra affair, one of the biggest political scandals of the Reagan era. Critics accused the administration of violating American law, secretly trading arms for hostages, and bypassing congressional authority. The controversy severely damaged public trust and revealed just how complicated and contradictory international politics surrounding the Iran-Iraq war had become. By the mid-1980s, the conflict was no longer simply a war between Iran and Iraq. It had evolved into a global struggle involving spies, secret deals, proxy conflicts, world politics, nuclear fears, and the competing interests of superpowers determined to shape the future of the Middle East. With foreign powers continuing to support Saddam Hussein's war effort, Iraq began searching for new ways to weaken Iran and force the conflict in its favor. By 1981, Saddam understood that his original dream of a quick and decisive victory had completely collapsed. The Iraqi invasion had stalled, casualties were mounting, and the economy was beginning to suffer under the immense pressure of prolonged warfare. Saddam feared that if the war dragged on for years, Iran's larger population and revolutionary determination could eventually overwhelm Iraq. Unable to secure total victory on the battlefield, he instead looked toward a new strategy, attacking Iran's economy directly. At the heart of Iran's economy was oil. Oil exports funded the Iranian government, supplied its military, and kept the war effort alive. If Iraq could cripple Iran's ability to export oil through the Persian Gulf, Saddam believed Tehran might eventually be forced to negotiate or collapse under financial pressure. To achieve this, Iraq turned once again to France. In 1981, Saddam placed major orders for advanced military equipment, including dozens of Dassault Mirage F-1 fighter aircraft. Among these were specially modified versions equipped for anti-ship warfare and armed with the deadly French-made Exocet missile. The urgency of Iraq's request was so great that some of these aircraft were reportedly diverted directly from deliveries intended for the French Air Force itself and transferred to Iraq instead. Saddam needed these aircraft immediately, as Iraq's own air force had suffered heavy losses during the early years of the war. The Mirage F-1S and Exocet missiles would become central weapons in a new phase of the conflict, the campaign against oil tankers and commercial shipping in the Persian Gulf. Saddam hoped that by destroying Iranian tankers and threatening international trade routes, he could isolate Iran economically and force the world to pressure Tehran into ending the war. But while Iraq waited for the Mirage aircraft to arrive, Saddam needed an immediate solution. Iraqi helicopters were already attempting attacks against shipping in the Gulf, but these operations achieved only limited success. Their range, speed, and firepower simply were not enough to seriously disrupt Iran's oil trade. Growing increasingly desperate, Iraq negotiated another deal with France, this time leasing 5 Super Intended attack aircraft from the French Navy. These aircraft had already gained international attention during the Falklands War in 1982, where Argentine pilots flying Super Intendeds armed with Exocet missiles had inflicted devastating losses on the British fleet. Now, those same aircraft would bring terror to the Persian Gulf. On March 27, 1984, Iraqi Super Intendeds launched their first major missile attacks against shipping in the Gulf. The attacks marked the beginning of what would soon become known worldwide as the Tanker War. By the end of that year alone, Iraqi aircraft had attacked dozens of ships from various nations operating in Gulf waters. Oil tankers, cargo vessels, and commercial ships suddenly found themselves caught in one of the most dangerous maritime conflict zones on Earth. Insurance prices skyrocketed, shipping companies panicked, and international concern rapidly grew. For Iran, stopping these attacks became a top priority. Iranian fighter pilots flying American-made F-14 Tomcats and other aircraft desperately hunted Iraqi strike planes over the Gulf. Iranian naval forces also attempted to intercept them, yet the Iraqi Super Intendeds proved extraordinarily difficult to destroy. Their pilots flew at extremely low altitude over the water, often only meters above the waves. Witnesses described their jet exhaust causing ripples across the sea surface as they raced toward their targets. Their speed, small size, and low-level approach made them elusive targets even for experienced Iranian pilots, despite repeated Iranian claims of successful interceptions. Only one Super Intended was ultimately lost during Iraqi service, and that occurred during a landing accident rather than in combat. Iran quickly retaliated with its own campaign against Iraqi and Gulf shipping. Iranian F-4 Phantom fighter jets attacked tankers carrying Iraqi oil, while Iranian naval forces and Revolutionary Guard speedboats harassed commercial vessels linked to Iraq and its Arab allies. Unlike Iran, however, Iraq possessed only a very small coastline along the Persian Gulf. This made Iraqi shipping especially vulnerable. The Iraqi Navy was also relatively weak and had already suffered severe damage from earlier Iranian airstrikes. Iraq depended heavily on foreign tankers and international shipping companies to move its oil exports through the Gulf. These ships soon became targets for Iranian aircraft, naval patrols, and sea mines. Iranian forces laid mines in critical waterways used by pro-Iraqi shipping, creating a deadly threat for commercial vessels moving through the region. As attacks increased from both sides, The international media began referring to the conflict at sea as the Tanker War. What had once been a regional land war was now threatening global energy supplies and international trade for Western powers. The situation became intolerable. The Persian Gulf was one of the world's most important oil routes, and any disruption risked severe economic consequences far beyond the Middle East. In response, major naval powers, including the United States, Britain, and France, deployed warships into the Gulf to protect commercial shipping and escort tankers through dangerous waters. Their presence dramatically increased the risk of direct confrontation between outside powers and Iran. The United States, under President Ronald Reagan, took particularly aggressive measures. In one controversial move, several Kuwaiti oil tankers were officially reflagged as American vessels. By placing them under the American flag, the United States could legally provide direct naval protection using the U.S. Navy. It was an extremely risky decision. Any attack on these ships now carried the possibility of dragging the United States directly into the war. But even the growing presence of Western warships failed to stop the violence. As the war continued into the mid and late 1980s, attacks against shipping only increased. Missiles, mines, fighter aircraft, helicopters, and fast attack boats transformed the Persian Gulf into one of the most dangerous waterways in the world. The Iran-Iraq War was no longer confined to trenches and deserts along the border. It had expanded into the skies above the Gulf, onto the world's shipping lanes, and into the heart of global politics, drawing superpowers ever closer to open involvement in one of the most destructive conflicts of the 20th century. At the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War, Iran possessed a significant numerical advantage over Iraq in terms of manpower and military resources. However, as the conflict dragged on year after year, Iraq rapidly expanded and reorganized its armed forces. Backed by massive foreign financial aid and a constant flow of weapons from the Soviet Union, France, China, and other nations, Saddam Hussein transformed the Iraqi military into one of the largest armies in the world. By the mid-1980s, Iraq's armed forces had grown to nearly 1 million men, making it the fourth largest military on earth at the time. In several key areas, particularly armored warfare, Iraq now surpassed Iran. Iraqi divisions fielded large numbers of modern Soviet-made T-72 tanks, advanced artillery systems, and heavily equipped mechanized infantry. To many military observers in Washington, London, and Paris, the situation seemed confusing. Iraq possessed superior equipment, strong international support, and an enormous army. Yet despite these advantages, Saddam Hussein still could not defeat Iran. The answer lay not only in equipment or numbers, but in leadership. Although Iran's military had been heavily damaged by the revolution and purges of experienced officers, the commanders who remained often proved highly resourceful and adaptable. Iranian leaders selected officers not only for ideological loyalty to the Islamic Republic, but also for battlefield competence. These commanders became skilled at improvising tactics and overcoming shortages of equipment and supplies. In contrast, Iraq's military leadership continued to suffer from Saddam Hussein's constant interference. Saddam frequently overruled his generals, dictated battlefield decisions personally, and punished officers harshly for failure or retreat. Fear dominated the Iraqi command structure, discouraging initiative and honest criticism. As frustration mounted, Saddam increasingly turned toward brutal methods to break Iran's resistance. One of the darkest chapters of the war began with Iraq's growing use of chemical weapons. In September 1983, during an Iranian offensive into northern Iraq supported by Kurdish fighters, Iraqi helicopters and artillery deployed chemical agents against advancing Iranian troops. Thousands of soldiers were exposed to poison gas. Entire units collapsed in agony as clouds of toxic chemicals drifted across the battlefield. Reports estimated that around 5,000 Iranians and even 2,000 Iraqis were killed during the attacks, halting the Iranian advance. The use of chemical weapons shocked the world, yet international reactions remained limited. Many nations quietly tolerated Iraq's actions because they feared an Iranian victory more than Saddam Hussein's brutality. Further south, Iran repeatedly launched offensives aimed at capturing the strategically vital Iraqi city of Basra. Basra was Iraq's gateway to the Persian Gulf and one of its most important economic centers. Iranian commanders believed that capturing the city could force Saddam Hussein to negotiate peace, but Iraqi defenses around Basra became some of the strongest fortifications of the entire war. Trenches, Bunkers, minefields, artillery positions, and armored formations created a deadly defensive network. Wave after wave of Iranian infantry assaults crashed against Iraqi lines, often suffering horrific casualties for minimal gains. Meanwhile, Iraq slowly recovered from the disasters of the early war years. After years on the defensive following the failed 1980 invasion, Saddam Hussein's forces regrouped, rearmed, and reorganized. By early 1986, Iraq felt strong enough to launch major new offensives. One key objective was Majnoon Island, an oil-rich area that Iran had captured in 1984. Control of the island threatened Iraqi oil exports and carried major economic importance. Iraqi forces attempted to retake it through large-scale assaults, but determined Iranian resistance prevented Iraq from reclaiming the territory. Even worse for Saddam, while Iraqi attention focused on Majnoon Island, Iran launched another major operation against the Al-Fa Peninsula near the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Using elite Revolutionary Guard units, Iranian forces successfully captured the peninsula in a surprise attack. The fall of Al-Fa was a humiliating blow for Iraq. Holding the peninsula allowed Iran to threaten shipping routes in the Gulf using Chinese-made Silkworm missiles launched from land-based positions. Iraq's vulnerability was once again exposed. By 1987, many Iraqi generals were reaching their breaking point. They had grown increasingly frustrated with Saddam Hussein's interference in military operations and his refusal to listen to professional advice. Some senior officers even hinted at the possibility of mutiny if Saddam continued directing the war personally. Faced with mounting pressure, Saddam reluctantly stepped back and allowed his generals greater control over military planning. This marked an important turning point for Iraq. The Iraqi army adopted new doctrines emphasizing better training, coordination, and preparation before launching operations. Large-scale military exercises and war games improved troop performance. Iraqi soldiers became more disciplined and effective, while the army continued expanding in size and capability. Yet despite these improvements, the strategic situation still appeared to favor Iran from the outside. What the world could not fully see, however, was that Iran itself was nearing exhaustion. After years of endless casualties, economic hardship, and destruction, the Iranian population was becoming deeply war-weary. Volunteer numbers began declining. Morale weakened. Equipment shortages worsened. At the same time, pressure from the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf was increasingly damaging Iran's economy during the tanker war. American naval forces openly protected Gulf shipping and occasionally engaged Iranian forces directly. Meanwhile, Iraqi oil exports received indirect protection through international support. While Iran found itself increasingly isolated, even incidents involving Iraq were sometimes politically manipulated against Iran. In 1987, the American warship USS Stark was accidentally struck by an Iraqi missile, killing dozens of U.S. sailors. Although Iraq eventually admitted responsibility, Washington initially framed the broader crisis in ways that still largely blamed Iranian aggression. Despite these pressures, Iran continued fighting. In the northern front, Iranian forces working alongside Kurdish fighters launched successful offensives deep into Iraqi territory. But Iran lacked the strength and resources to fully exploit these victories. By now, both sides understood the terrible reality confronting them. The war had become a nightmare neither nation could truly win. In July 1987, the United Nations called on both Iran and Iraq to cease hostilities and return to pre-war borders under Resolution 598. At first, both governments rejected the proposal. Neither Saddam Hussein nor Ayatollah Khomeini wanted to appear weak or admit failure. But by 1988, exhaustion was consuming both countries. Nearly 1 million people had been killed or wounded during 8 years of war. Entire cities had been destroyed. Economies were collapsing. Generations of young men had vanished into trenches, minefields, and chemical clouds. Still, Saddam Hussein prepared one final massive offensive. Before launching it, Iraq carried out one of the most infamous atrocities of the war. On March 16, 1988, Iraqi aircraft and helicopters attacked the Kurdish town of Halabja with chemical weapons. Shortly after Iranian-supported Kurdish forces had taken control of the area, nerve gas and poison chemicals spread through the town, killing around 7,000 civilians and injuring thousands more. Men, women, and children died where they stood. Entire families were found dead in streets and homes. The massacre at Halabja became one of the worst chemical attacks against civilians in modern history. Soon afterward, Iraq launched its major 1988 offensives. Iranian forces, exhausted and overstretched, began retreating from many positions they had held for years, including territories captured inside Iraq. Iraq also used chemical weapons extensively during these campaigns, particularly during operations to retake the Al-Faw Peninsula. Chemical attacks spread not only across battlefields but also against Iranian towns near the border. Iraq even threatened to target major Iranian cities if the war continued. At sea, tragedy struck Iran again. On April 18, 1988, the United States launched Operation Praying Mantis in retaliation for Iranian mining operations in the Gulf. American naval forces destroyed Iranian ships and severely damaged parts of Iran's navy in one of the largest naval clashes involving the U.S. since World War II. Then, on July 3, 1988, disaster struck when the American warship USS Vincennes mistakenly identified an Iranian civilian airliner as a hostile military aircraft and shot it down over the Persian Gulf. All 290 civilians aboard were killed. The incident horrified Iran and further intensified anti-American anger throughout the region. Inside Tehran, Ayatollah Khomeini's advisors delivered grim assessments. Continuing the war would require massive new military spending, additional mobilization, and perhaps many more years of fighting stretching into the 1990s. Iran simply could not endure much longer. Reluctantly, Khomeini accepted United Nations Resolution 598 on July 20, 1988, agreeing to a ceasefire and negotiations based on returning to pre-war borders. For the Ayatollah, accepting peace was emotionally devastating. He famously compared the decision to drinking a cup of poison. Then, only 2 years later, Saddam Hussein shocked the world once again. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, the very country The legacy of the Iran-Iraq War remains one of the darkest and most devastating chapters in modern Middle Eastern history. After 8 years of relentless fighting, entire cities lay in ruins, economies were shattered, and nearly 1 million people had been killed or wounded. What began as Saddam Hussein's attempt to secure regional dominance instead became a catastrophe that scarred an entire generation across both Iran and Iraq. Throughout the conflict, Iraq carried out actions that shocked much of the world. Saddam Hussein's regime invaded a neighboring country, launched missile attacks against civilian populations, bombed cities far from the front lines, and repeatedly used chemical weapons against both soldiers and civilians. Entire Kurdish communities suffered horrifying attacks, most infamously in Halabja, where poison gas killed thousands of innocent people in only a matter of hours. Even international shipping and Western naval personnel became casualties as the war expanded into the Persian Gulf during the Tanker War. And yet, despite all of this, many Western governments still viewed revolutionary Iran as the greater long-term threat. Fear of Iran's Islamic Revolution spreading across the Middle East pushed numerous countries into supporting Iraq financially, militarily, or politically during the war. From Saddam Hussein's perspective, this international tolerance may have created a dangerous illusion, the belief that future acts of aggression would once again be met with limited resistance from the outside world. That belief would prove disastrous. By 1990, Iraq was drowning in debt, its economy crippled after years of war with Iran. Saddam Hussein believed that invading the oil-rich nation of Kuwait could solve Iraq's financial problems and restore his country's regional power. He likely assumed the international community would respond with the same hesitation and division that had characterized much of the Iran-Iraq War. But this time, he was wrong. The invasion of Kuwait triggered immediate international outrage. Led by the United States, a massive coalition of nations assembled to force Iraq out of Kuwait during the 1991 Gulf War. In only a matter of weeks, Iraq's military, once considered one of the most powerful in the region, was devastated by overwhelming Western air power and advanced military technology. In just 11 years, Saddam Hussein had transformed Iraq from a rising regional power into an isolated and economically broken state surrounded by hostile neighbors and dependent on the decisions of foreign powers. Many American leaders believed that leaving Saddam Hussein in power after the Gulf War meant the conflict had been left unfinished. That belief would shape future events in the Middle East. Following the September 11th attacks and the beginning of the War on Terror in the early 21st century, Iraq once again became the target of American and British military intervention. In 2003, coalition forces invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein's regime. While the invasion ended Saddam's dictatorship, it also unleashed years of instability, insurgency, sectarian violence, and terrorism that would consume Iraq for decades afterward. Iran, meanwhile, emerged from the Iran-Iraq War with its own lasting scars and deep distrust toward the international community. Iranian leaders never forgot how quickly many nations had armed and supported Iraq during the conflict. Over time, Iran responded by expanding its influence across the region, supporting allied groups and militias in countries such as Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The memory of the war, combined with the constant fear of future confrontation with the United States or Israel, helped shape modern Iranian politics and society. For decades, the sense of external threat encouraged many Iranians to focus outward against perceived foreign enemies rather than inward against domestic problems. This atmosphere often strengthened the position of the Islamic Republic's leadership, even during periods of internal unrest or declining popularity. Today, the Middle East still lives in the shadow of the Iran-Iraq War. Many of the region's modern conflicts, rivalries, and political tensions can trace part of their origins back to those 8 brutal years of bloodshed. From sectarian divisions and proxy wars to foreign intervention and ideological struggles, the consequences of the conflict continue to echo across the region, and as new crises continue to emerge in the Middle East, the final legacy of the Iran-Iraq War remains unfinished, a reminder of how one conflict can reshape nations, alter global politics, and leave wounds that endure for generations.